Right. I'm sort of old-fashioned. I brought regular old paper. It still works. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to present not my own work, as you already know, but that of my colleague, Ragnhild Sidler. And she's worked very hard to make this happen, and she really wanted to be here with you. But last week she found out she couldn't make the trip due to her pregnancy. And so she asked me to represent her, because I'm familiar with the subject matter, and I've read some drafts along the way. And as her stand-in, I believe I can give her presentation a fair run, but I might falter when it comes to your questions and in the discussions after. So please bear this in mind and read her paper in the conference proceedings to balance out any deficiencies on my part. So she would also like to convey her gratitude for presenting the paper here, and I to her for letting me steal all the fuss and stand here. So, at FFI, Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, Ragnhild's research is geared towards supporting organizations and practitioners implement cyber defense into military processes. And through this work, as many of you probably have seen yourself, she's seen how difficult it can be to pierce the veil of tech-heavy descriptions of incidents and capabilities and get a grip on their implications and their appropriate responses. So they're often intangible, especially to non-technical people, and often described in more sensational terms than is warranted. So Ragnhild, as a political scientist, wanted to write a paper giving a power perspective from the nation-state's point of view. And she also wanted to help us understand CNA threats from this level, and not just with political and military leaders, but also with analysts involved in cyber defense and doctrine development. So, that said, she asked the question, in what ways can an actor apply CNA to dominate an opponent, and what may restrict him in this effort? And the word dominate does not mean the same in this context as it is often thought of in the military context. This is on the political level. So to answer this question, she used renowned power theorist Thomas Schelling as a theoretical point of view, and this naturally shapes the remainder of my presentation as well as her paper. And Schelling distinguishes between coercion and brute force, which is summarized in this quote. There's a difference between taking what you want and making someone give it to you, between losing what someone can forcibly take and giving up to avoid risk or damage. And so, coercion is about what you can make someone give up to avoid risk or damage, whilst brute force is when someone forcibly takes what they want. This theoretical perspective requires us to distinguish between CNA that inflicts harm and CNA that imposes limitations, CNA that is coercive and CNA that is brute force. And according to Schelling, coercion is a form of bargaining power that actor A makes use of in order to affect the cost-benefit analysis of actor B. So coercive power is about influencing decision-making, and it's closely related to the ability to inflict harm. Brute force, on the other hand, the other type of power, is defined as the application of strength in pursuit of self-interest without direct appeal to actor B's decision-making. Brute force is something actor A just does. It is the application of capabilities to enforce and carry out actions in pursuit of a given objective. So delving deeper into other forms of coercion, such as deterrence, is outside the scope of this paper. So I focus on these two broad distinctions between coercion and brute force. So how can we understand CNA through these lenses? Let's begin with coercion. In order to transform actions into coercive power, the impact of those actions must be sufficiently severe, and the threat of those actions must be credible. In terms of severity, Schelling refers to pain and grief, the ability of an attacker to inflict harm upon his opponent. So the amount of pain and grief necessary to produce coercive power follows a rational choice logic, whereby the cost inflicted through CNA must be higher than the value put on staying firm and enduring that cost. In light of this, if we are to discuss the impact of CNA, it's useful to distinguish between unsophisticated and sophisticated attacks. If you train your eyes on the cyber kill chain model on the right-hand side, Sophisticated attacks, as you know, levy significant resources on all these stages, and not just in terms of currency. In contrast to this, unsophisticated CNA picks the low-hanging fruit using techniques readily available to anyone. So because methods are readily available to anyone, even the least resourced actor and many others can satisfy the requirement of credibility, meaning their ability to conduct some form of CNA is real. The remaining question is whether these capabilities can inflict the necessary amount of pain and grief and produce coercive power. So in the unsophisticated end of the spectrum, you all probably know the attacks on Estonia in 2007. These can quite reasonably be interpreted as an attempt to coerce a different decision with regards to the World War II memorial. Although the attacks were numerous and the effects highly visible, there are, to the best of our knowledge, no reports of human suffering as a result. Ragnhild therefore argues the level of severity was not sufficient. There was not enough pain and grief caused to produce coercive power and influence the Estonian decision. Simply put, the attacker did not put enough power to hurt into his attack. If there was any coercive effect at all, it might better be described as a reprisal. A reprisal aims at imposing punishment to influence future decisions, not present decisions. And through this reprisal, the attacker states that I may not be able to influence your decision in this particular dispute, but you shall not get your way free of costs. And these costs I impose upon you are to remind you and others to think twice before going against my interests in the future. Moving on, any threat of harm must be credible. And credibility, according to Schelling, is about communicating that an actor actually intends to carry out hostile actions, as opposed to giving the impression you're bluffing. Credibility depends on the defender's expectations and not necessarily on real capabilities. The threat of sophisticated CNA against industrial control systems is frequently mentioned as a type of cyber threat which would inflict physical damage or cause serious disruptions, and therefore could potentially deliver pain and grief. But as Martin Lebicki and many others have pointed out, it's challenging to predict the full range of consequences from CNA. This unpredictability can make it difficult to convince the defender he will be better off giving in based on a given threat. So in essence, the defender will find it difficult to know what risk or damage he's trying to avoid by giving in. One way an actor can enhance his credibility is by using capabilities. Through inflicting pain and grief in one specific incident, he can demonstrate that more is to come. And Schelling uses the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as an example of this, stating they hurt, they promised more hurt, and this was their purpose. So we'll call this the promise of more. And a credible promise of more is much more difficult with sophisticated CNA, because the code is highly tailored to each specific target. The cyber kill chain is unique. So from this, we infer that one successful attack does not necessarily demonstrate the ability to repeat. It is not the same promise of more as that was made in 1945. And so far, we've discussed how an attacker can use CNA as coercive power and what challenges he may face. We now move on to brute force, the second form of power, which is a means of forcible accomplishment. Brute force is a form of power where the attacker uses his strength, skill, and ingenuity to shape circumstances to his advantage, doing so without the dependence on the other party's decision makers. The attacker just does this and no appeal to the decision makers. So succeeding in all 7 steps of the cyber kill chain model for sophisticated CNA requires strength, skill, and ingenuity. It requires strength in terms of organizational and technological sophistication. It requires ingenuity and skill in terms of reconnaissance, social engineering, and access. So Stuxnet is one potential example of sophisticated CNA used as brute force power. In this covert action, the attacker did not appeal to the decision makers, but instead attempted to forcibly impose limitations. Of course, Stuxnet happened in the context of many other efforts to influence Iran, and that's not the point with this analysis. Stuxnet here serves as one example of disablement through the use of CNA. Ragnhild also argues the more unsophisticated CNA against Georgian communication channels in 2008 can also be seen as an example of brute force because it was not contingent on Georgian decision makers, but rather disrupted their ability to manage the situation. So in this view, unsophisticated CNA can also be a way to impose limitations and thus become brute force. So it can also be useful in conflict. In conclusion, Ragnhild wanted to discuss in what ways an actor can apply CNA to dominate an opponent and what may restrict him in this effort. The analysis took a nation-state perspective and indicated that an actor can use CNA as brute force or coercion, but there are key challenges to remember. With brute force, he's restricted by his level of strength, skill, and ingenuity. And using CNA as a means to coerce, there are challenges with sufficient severity and making a credible threat. So what does this mean for cyber defense strategy and doctrine developers? One recommendation is to primarily focus on CNA as a means of forcible accomplishment and keep in mind the potential for reprisals. This makes it easier to identify what mitigating measures are suitable in each context. Second recommendation would be to nuance the threat picture by distinguishing between attacks that aim to influence decision makers and attacks that seek to impose limitations. Nuancing the threat picture this way makes it easier to communicate to non-technical people what kind of threats they are facing, and therefore will enhance their cyber situational awareness. So I sincerely hope I've done Ragnhild justice with this presentation. I again encourage you to read her paper, and I'll leave you with this slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions? Short questions right now? Thank you. And please, Tim, it's your turn now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go really old school. I'm just going to read from a bit of paper. So I've effectively bombed myself back to the Stone Age. So I'm afraid there's no slides. So I'm a security studies guy within international relations, within IR. So one of the things we like to do is, rather than get wrapped up in the novelty of the phenomena we're seeking to discuss, we always try and strip it back to the basic concepts that we're looking at. And some of these are perennial concerns of IR scholars, not least of which, of course, is power. But we could be talking about sovereignty, dominion, and so on, all relevant concepts. And one of the things we're trying to work out is whether there's something truly novel about what we're looking at, or whether it's just old wine in new bottles. So that's the perspective I'm coming from when I'm talking about power. And obviously, coming third in a line of speakers, I'm wondering whether I'm actually going to be saying something new myself. So please forgive me if much of what I say you will already have heard, but hopefully there'll be a couple of things in there that we can latch onto. So when we're thinking about cyber power, generally, when we're confronted with this idea, one of the things that we often do is we default to thinking about institutions. We think about governments, we think about militaries, we think about intergovernmental organizations like NATO, and we try and think about what power these actors have. What power do they have in the international system? What power do they possess? And what can they do with this power that they have in their grasp? And I want to suggest, and if you dig into the papers these guys have written in this year's volume, I want to suggest that this is quite a limited perspective on cyber power. And if we want to understand what cyber power is, or what it does, or what it might be able to do in the world, we should think a little bit more deeply on the nature of power itself. What different forms does it take? What are the myriad ways in which it operates? And who are the actors? What is the diversity of actors in this space, and not just institutions? And all these different actors are involved in this complex, this manifold, if you like, of cyber power. Who are they and what do they do? Now, those are all big questions. So today I'm just going to focus on something that Jelle's talked about in his paper, which is something called productive power. It's part of a typology of power developed in international politics and international relations. It's a standard framework for looking at power. And in that sense, the question is really, what does cyber power produce? And I'm going to use the word produce in a very specific sense, which I'll describe in a moment. And I'm going to make 4 points, really as a means of encouraging discussion. There's no finality to what I'm going to say. And the 4 points are these. The first is that power is about relationships. I'm sure you're familiar with that concept. The second is that this thing I'm calling, or that is called in the literature productive power, is about a certain type of relationship, a certain set of relationships which we can identify in broad terms. And the third point is to ask about what does this mean when we're thinking about cyber power? Because it's quite an abstract concept, this productive power idea, but what does it mean when we're thinking about cyber power in fora like this? Then, of course, why does it matter? The classic academic question, why should anyone think about this? Why should they spend their time thinking about something as abstract as this? Why does it matter? And the essential answer to that, without it being too much of a spoiler, is because productive power, in the way I'm thinking about it, is essential to absolutely everything that we do. Okay, so to the first point about power being relational rather than being possessive. And a very simple explanation or example that I might use for this is that you can have the biggest, most badass, high-tech military in the world, but it only takes on meaning in relationships with others. And this happens in 2 principal ways. The first is you can do something kinetic with it. You can interact militarily with others. And that leads to victory, surrender, stalemate, some other state perhaps. But you're doing something with it in a relationship, a physical relationship with an adversary. The second thing you can do with your badass high-tech military is that you can signal to others. You can signal capability, you can signal intent to potential adversaries, and that, of course, is the basis for deterrence, for compellence, dynamics that occur because of cognitive factors and considerations rather than the kinetic use of armed force. But in both cases, your massive high-tech military only takes on meaning because you and it are in relationships with others. And power manifests through relations, whether that's in war or in peace, or whatever we're calling those states of being these days. But power is not something possessed and then deployed, but it's something that's developed through interrelations with others. So that's my first pitch, is that power is relational, not possessive. You have to, it's constructed and operates through relations rather than being something powerful in and of itself. So what is productive power in this relational sense? Well, let's take the example of war. And war is often seen primarily through the Clausewitzian lens. And there won't be a person in the room who doesn't understand what I'm talking about. But war as being something coercive, something compulsory, in terms of compelling a party to do something violent even. But yet the critique of war in the 21st century revolves around the idea that war cannot be won solely in kinetic fashion. It cannot usually be done without winning over people by non-violent means. And a recent example might be counterinsurgency, in which we hear a lot about hearts and minds, or minds and wills. And contemporary coin doctrine, counterinsurgency doctrine, puts right at the forefront this idea that non-kinetic operations are the key to success. If you win over the people, that's home and abroad, and you will prevail. Winning the firefight is simply not enough. You scale that up to the international level, the realm of states, and we're accustomed these days to thinking about soft power to complement the hard power of military force. And soft power aims to influence the cognitive processes of allies and adversaries. And over the last decade and a half, we've heard a lot about public diplomacy, strategic narratives, strategic communication, and these practices intend to align people's beliefs, values, thoughts, desires, and ultimately actions with our own interests. And they aim to derive strategic effect through non-kinetic means. And in terms of typologies of power, here I'm drawing liberally from political theory, international politics. These approaches are all forms of what are called productive power. Non-kinetic, cognitive, ideational, interactive, relational. These are forms of social communication that are productive because they produce effects in others without the use of force. But productive power isn't just about producing effects in the behavior of others, it also produces the identities of those other parties. And to understand this, we must consider that productive power should be understood in terms of discourses. Now, I'm a European academic, so I'm contractually obliged to mention a dead French philosopher in every single presentation that I give. So today I'm just going to say Michel Foucault, and this is, if you're interested in discourse and productive power, a lot of this, what I'm talking about, comes from Foucault's work. I'll just put that to one side. So when we're talking about discourses, we're not just talking about words, which is the general public way we think of discourses. Discourses are systems of meaning, and they shape what people think, but they also shape what people are. And discourses categorize the world. They create and they stabilize identities. And often discourses create binaries, good and bad, moral and immoral, friend and foe, us and them, and so on. And other actions flow from that. They have a practical effect. If you cannot identify an enemy, you cannot fight it. And once you've fixed the enemy's identity, you can target it in whatever ways you then see fit, through force, through influence, or via other means. And importantly, by fixing that identity, to a certain extent, you help determine what the holder of that identity can do. You shape their capabilities through discourses, and therefore you inhibit or encourage particular modes of action. So productive power is those forms of power that work through discourses, that create systems of meaning, systems of power and knowledge that shape what actors can be and what they can do. And crucially, when we're thinking about cyber power, these actors are not just the institutions I mentioned at the outset, but all manner of non-state actors or sub-state actors too. Citizens, civil society, NGOs, media, enterprise, and so on. They all have interests and stakes inside and outside the global information environment. Excuse me. So what does this mean then for thinking about cyber power? And this is my third point. Well, the first thing to suggest, and I don't mean to be controversial with respect to the theme of this conference, is that cyber power doesn't exist. Not in any sort of elementary sense, at least. But I should qualify that statement. And in this context, cyber, whether you like or loathe that term, is just an adjective, or a modifier, more precisely, like land, sea, air, space. Cyber power is just power that happens to be mediated through or created in the context of networked information technologies. Cyber, if you will. So let's not get sidetracked by assuming that the nature of cyber power is somehow different from the nature of power, because it isn't. However, it does take on different manifestations and different modes of operation. Of course it does. But cyber power is still power, rather than a distinct and distinctive category in and of itself at some fundamental level. So that's the first point. Cyber power is power. The second point is that thinking about power in terms of productive power is really not as novel or as abstract as it sounds. We're accustomed to soft power, for example, and it's fairly obvious how the instruments of soft power can shape people through discourses and narratives. And in fact, most governments try to do just that. At home and abroad, in peace and in war, we shape norms and values, beliefs and ideas, and of course, identities. And as an information environment, cyberspace, if we can use that word, is ideally suited to these forms of productive power. Governments use all manner of informational means to pursue their objectives, whether it's through social media, whether it's simple things like press releases, public information campaigns, or outright propaganda. But let's flip that emphasis just for a moment. Because productive power is not just about how governments and states and intergovernmental institutions shape the information space. It's also about how non-state actors shape institutional beliefs and behaviors. And productive power, productive cyber power, it's not just the exclusive preserve of the traditionally powerful, if you will. Non-state actors also develop and reproduce discourses about state actors. They give institutions identities too, and help shape how they think and how they act. And when I mentioned earlier that productive power fixes identity and meaning, that's true, but it's only in a temporary sense. Identities and meanings shift over time. They change, fairly evidently. But they also interact with one another in this domain of discursive, productive power. So the attributes that someone ascribes to me can be used to restrict my possible modes of action, just as the identity I give to them restricts theirs. There's a process of interaction, of relationality. And the two play off each other recursively and iteratively, each shaping the other over time. How people think about NATO, for example, shapes what NATO is, what NATO does, and what NATO can do, or what it is allowed to do. And thinking about power in this sense is at the heart of political communication and all forms of political action. We want people to come around to our way of thinking, often because their perception of us is different from our perception of ourselves. And what's been forgotten time and again over the last decade and a half, although I think we've come a long way since 2001, is that how people think of us restricts what we can do legitimately. And if cyber power is to be a meaningful element of strategy, cyber operations can not only be desirable and feasible, which are very important considerations for sure, but they also have to be legitimate. And legitimacy, as being very distinct from legality, as a separate term, different concept, legitimacy only arises in this field of productive power. Without legitimacy, no armed or military campaign will succeed, no matter how many battles you win. And I would argue this applies to cyber operations as much as it does to the conventional application of force. So why does this matter? Well, I want to sum up why I think a discussion of the productive aspects of cyber power is important, and I'll make two main points. First is because discussions of cyber power, current company aside, do not usually consider productive power. It's a very well-known political, theoretical concept, but they just don't talk about it. And cyber power needs to be discussed in the rounds with all the intellectual tools we have at our disposal. It may be that talking about productive cyber power goes absolutely nowhere in terms of the practicalities of what most people in this room do for a living, but it's certainly something we should consider. So it needs to be discussed in the round in all its aspects, not just to focus on coercion, control, force, compulsion, and so on. Because narrow conceptions of cyber power, and after all, we are just at the beginning of this discussion, narrow conceptions of cyber power might lead to narrow classes of action and potentially counterproductive or undesirable outcomes. And the second is because productive power understood in these terms is right at the heart of what states and militaries do in the 21st century. In fact, from a political science perspective, productive power is not just central to thinking about power, it's actually foundational. And without understanding how productive power works, other forms of, and why it works the way it does, other forms of action become untethered from politics. And coercion and force are no longer, if they ever were, the defining characteristics of war, or indeed of any conflict. And productive power allows us to think a little more deeply about the implications of our actions in the world, how they affect others, how they affect us. And cyber power, importantly, is not just the domain of military or other state action. Cyber power involves everyone, not just men and women in business suits and uniform. So to finish, I'm not suggesting here that we reinvent the wheel. My primary concern is that our discussions of cyber power do not ignore the discursive, productive aspects of what we do or what we plan to do. And we need, for example, to move beyond these discussions of hard and soft power and consider cyber power first as power, because there's a whole raft of intellectual tools that you can bring to bear on this situation. And secondly, as far more complex, nuanced, and contested, in fact, than this binary characterization of hard and soft power suggests. And I don't know if anyone's read Fred Kaplan's recent book, Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War. A few nods in the audience. It's a cracking read. But he has a line in there which I'm going to paraphrase. And he says, when cyberspace is everywhere, cyber power seeps through every digital pore. And cyber power is indeed everywhere. And so too are the actors and the agents of cyber power. And institutions like NATO have a great deal of responsibility to those actors and must ensure their own accountability and legitimacy is understood and communicated. And productive power is the principal means of developing legitimacy. And I certainly don't expect policymakers and practitioners to start talking about productive power in the abstract terms I'm talking about today, but at least an understanding of productive power can help contribute to how productive power in terms of discourses and so on can contribute to actually very concrete outcomes for better or for worse. And in that respect alone, I'm going to offer it to you for your consideration. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, finally, this is the time for discussion and questions. Yes, please. At the front here. And please say your name and affiliation.
Brigadier General Duchesne, Netherlands Defense Academy. I've got a question. Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations, very crisp and clear. Taking Jelle's presentation, he showed us 4 manifestations of power. And if I'm correct, they're from Betts and Stevens, cybersecurity and the state. And I'd like to ask Dr. Stevens, what about the other 2 elements or the manifestations of power? Institutional and structural forms of powers. Because you solely focused on productive power, but there are other manifestations as well. Could you add something to that?
Sure. Yeah, the reason I focused on productive power is because it's the one people don't normally talk about. But yeah, Jelle, you might want to talk about this as well in a minute. But yeah, 4 main types of power defined within the political science literature. So we've talked about compulsory power, power of A to get B to do something. We talked about productive power in the sense that that's the sort of power that works through diverse and diffuse networks of social interactions. They produce identities. It's about norms, beliefs, ideas, and so on. And obviously, any form of power can be asymmetric. In fact, almost all instances of power are. There's other ways power can work as well, by using institutions to effect particular direct outcomes as well. So I think you mentioned that in the sense of it's very different getting a UN resolution to force another state party to do something, but you're doing it through an institution rather than using military or kinetic means to try and force that outcome. That's the sort of institutional power that we're talking about in that space. Structural power is a sort of concept that Marxists and other structuralists might like to talk about, which is how power manifests through the structures of international life, whether that is global capitalism, which is a very good example of power asymmetries within the structures of the way the international system is actually ordered. It's a much more difficult one in terms of cyber power to make that one stick, to be honest. And I think a lot more work needs to be done about how structural power manifests or why it's important for a consideration of cyber power. But that's the beauty of this conversation, because there's so much work to be done using this enormous political, philosophical concept that we have. You simply can't take it from the shelf and apply it to cyberspace and expect it all to work. But you also can't apply it to cyber and expect things not to be important. So structural power might actually be a very important consideration when we're thinking about cyber power. And certainly institutional power is, because, I mean, you mentioned the examples of ICANN and ITU are very current examples, are they not? About how nations are trying to use institutions to further their own national interests. And rather than going head to head, they're using institutions to do that. So it's not exactly a proxy form of action. It's a slightly more diffuse form of action using other agents, if you like, within that matrix. Do you want to add to that?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. Yes, please.
First of all, I'm Daniel Moore, King's College London. Thank you all for your presentations. I agree with the sentiment that cyber power is at the heart of it, just a projection of power through technological means. And taking that and your presentations into account, and this is an open question to you all, do you feel that the rise of cyber capabilities has affected the symmetry or asymmetry of the overall power calculus. We see a lot of writing today about how incorporating cyber capabilities into military doctrine may upset the power of balance for certain countries, or perhaps even for some sub-state actors and their capabilities to project power against their adversaries. And I'm wondering if you feel that's a significant component in that power calculus nowadays.
Would like to? Jelle, please.
Yeah, well, the first issue of asymmetry is very interesting in this domain, I think, because if you look classically, as I was taught during field exercises, that if you want to overcome a defensive position, you had to have a preferable ratio for 3:1 to every attacker to every defender. If you look at cyber capabilities, you just need one attacker and many defenders to lock down a network. So asymmetry is certainly a dimension when assessing power. So I think asymmetry should be covered whenever you're trying to say something about power. So I agree fully with your statement on that. So, yeah.
Any other comment?
Yeah, I mean, all instances of power are asymmetric. The secret for the analyst is then to work out where those asymmetries lie, which is precisely what fuels your question. To directly answer your question, I think there are probably more instances of asymmetry, whether that can be understood in terms of rebalancing power, or whether these are new instances of power. I suspect it's the latter, that certain actors are relatively more empowered than they were because of these technological capabilities. How that plays out long term, I don't know, because I see very little evidence in terms of national security, at least for the retreat of the state. All I see is more non-state threats and the pushback from various state parties to that. There's a strong argument you'll be aware of in international political economy that the state is retreating in the face of lots of non-state actors being empowered in economic terms, but I don't necessarily see that applying at the moment. That said, we've all spent years and years talking about precisely the rise in those kind of threats. So clearly there is something going on there, and clearly that certain actors do feel relatively more empowered than perhaps they would be without these cyber capabilities. It's a classic question of continuity and change, isn't it? And what the balance is between the two. And I'm sure everyone in this room has their own particular take on where that balance lies. But I think in general, yes, you're right. Yeah.
One question from my side. In ideal world, there is some kind of connection. At least there should be kind of connection between theoretical or research community and the practical world. I think that all of us, a few weeks ago, we read the news about the first official announcement of using cyber military tools. That was the US statements using the cyber military tools against ISIS. Was that just a sign of coercive power, or what was that actually? What was behind that announcement, or was it something else? Jordan.
Which announcement? Sorry.
The US announcement of using cyber command capabilities against ISIS.
Against ISIS. Well, my personal view on that would be, trying to represent Ragnhild here as well, whether that is coercive against ISIL, I'm not so sure. I think they probably feel the intelligence more than like the word that we're using this stuff against you. But I suppose it's also just an opportunity to say we are using this stuff in a relation where that is not as damaging as would be between states, perhaps. So I'm not sure I'd read too much into the statement itself as coercive force. But.
Read through the lens of productive power, there are other things you can say about, and I assume you're referring to talk of cyber bombs being dropped on Daesh. Yeah, there's a couple of members of the audience here who wrote an op-ed for Council of Foreign Relations about this particular issue, which took high-ups and brass of the US military to task for this, calling them cyber bombs. Well, why would you call them cyber bombs? Well, from a productive power aspect, it's very clear that you're trying to signal something there in terms of the destructive capability of these particular tools. But that's all they were tools. I don't think there's any suggestion from anyone in the defense establishment seriously saying that these are bomb-like capabilities. They're cyber operational tools used in cyber operations against the known adversary, and how specifically how they were used in terms of your framework of coercion and so on. I'm not personally too sure, but there's definitely a discursive aspect to the announcement that these were being used, and potentially trying to generate some deterrent effect potentially against Daesh, or some other effects even amongst potential adversaries and other parties besides. So I think, you know, when we're thinking about these specific instances, we can use these tools of power analysis to actually think through, particularly the announcements surrounding these developments, to think through what they actually mean in various terms, rather than just being tools of coercion, control, force, and violence.
Would you like to add something? Any more questions? Yeah, please.
Jo Hare, UK Government Cyber Policy. How do you think the problem of anonymity or attribution and the difficulty of attribution affects the productive power dynamic? You talked about you define your enemy so that you can fight your enemy. How does the problem of attribution and relative anonymity in cyber affect our ability to counter that, our adversaries, through productive power?
I'm not sure I follow you, sorry.
I'm just saying, you actually talked about you need to be able to define your enemy through discourse, and you identify your enemy. If it's actually very hard legitimately to legitimize how you've identified your enemy, how does that affect how you then deal with that adversary?
Okay, understood. Yeah, it's a good question. And it has obvious ramifications, does it not? It's very difficult to fight an adversary you cannot detect. There's people in the room far better placed than I to address the attribution issue. But certainly I think attribution is sort of a default anonymity, isn't it? Or the attribution problem, rather, leads to a default anonymity. Specifically, it's very difficult to, I mean, what can I say? I mean, to identify, not be able to identify where something's coming from is immensely problematic. So I think it's entirely consistent with a productive power reading of that situation. The problem then becomes, of course, when you invent enemies. And I think that's happened numerous times when we talk about the attribution problem, and we got it wrong. And things tend to go quite quiet then. Rather than retract these statements, they tend to just get lost. So, I mean, I don't think it's any more than a technical problem in one sense, but you know, from a political perspective, it's immensely problematic. Sure, something's happened. But I mean, I've argued previously that actually were something to reach the threshold of being a significant cyber operation against the nation state, for example, it's very unlikely that the perpetrator of that attack would remain anonymous. That's not the case. I'm not talking about espionage. I'm talking about actual quasi-military operations or destructive operations against the nation state for the purpose of causing harm, whether that's to civilian infrastructure, military infrastructure, the economy, whatever. And it's very unlikely, if you just read it through the lens of pure strategy, it's very unlikely for that perpetrator not to reveal itself. So in those situations, I imagine that the anonymity issue and the attribution issue fall away, because the perpetrator wants to be identified. And then it becomes very easy to say who the enemy is because they've just told you who they are. But I mean, I certainly think, you know, there are aspects to attribution and anonymity that do make things very problematic, but that's a whole different discussion.
Anyone else like to add?
No, that was sort of what I was alluding to in the introduction there. You need to contextualize things, and then you might understand that, yeah, they're unlikely to want to remain anonymous in that type of situation. And so if you nuance your analysis in that way, you will get to those kind of answers. And I think that and many more is the road ahead.
Sorry, just to add, I mean, there are, these days, a lot of people working on the attribution problem as being something that can be solved by, or not solved necessarily, but progressed through triangulating all manner of different information, data, contextual factors, and politics, and so on. So It's not resolved by any stretch, is it? But getting there, I think.
But German is framework provided by you, coercion and brute force. Is it totally unusable in the context of anonymous attacks?
No,
or is there still some value?
We use this term, perhaps Cold War term as well, attributable but deniable sort of stuff, which if you think about the DDoS attacks against Estonia in 2007, they are a typical example of attributable attack. Sort of you can feel where this signal is coming from, so whether or not that was true, the Estonian way of living through this event remains the same, right? So it's a sort of attributable but deniable attack, much like Soviet submarines in the outside of Sweden during the Cold War, until one ran aground and you can see, oh yeah, it's really a sub. So it's not completely out of the realm of reprisals, is what I'm trying to say, to use anonymity. Of course, with coercion, you could be in a position where you have to prove it was you, rather than the opposite.
And in the Estonia case, the interesting thing there, even though technically it was anonymous, somebody has identified you as the enemy, which in a particular way is another instance of productive power. It just happens to be one that's incredibly problematic from the state perspective, because you cannot respond. But that's because they're constraining their capabilities through discourses. You're the enemy, not us, that kind of thing.
We still have some minutes. Yes, please, at the end of it.
Hi, my name is Matthias Schulz, International Relations Scholar from Germany. Thank you all for the presentation. I think you really did a good job on demystifying some aspects, especially the predominant focus on the power as resource understanding that military people often work with. And I wonder if, thinking about the productive power aspect, if our language, how we describe the phenomena, we speak about cyber conflict, we speak about war, we speak about cyber terrorism, brute force, computer network attacks, all these types of words distort the real phenomena in a way that the major issue in cyberspace is not war, it's not espionage, it's crime. The majority of cyber attacks are crime-based. So I wonder if our language is distorting the real phenomena here.
It seems that you have taken the hot seat.
I'll happily take that one. No, that's fine. I was being very specific when I used those terms in my presentation, but I entirely take your point that, for example, saying we are in the midst of a cyber war when what we're talking about is criminality and espionage is simply not helpful. And I think, given where we were, say, 5 or 6 years ago, when that sort of terminology was rampant, I think professionals and academics and policymakers, not all policymakers, but a lot of us have moved quite far beyond the war frame. Tend to talk about conflict a lot because there is a form of political conflict going on in terms of cyber criminality. So I think that's still valid, but I entirely take your point that framing things in problematic ways is counterproductive. And it can facilitate certain forms of political action, but it can obstruct and constrain others. So we have to be a lot more specific. I think everyone in this room would be very specific about what they're talking about. But a part of the challenge of groups like CCD, COE, and NATO more generally, and national militaries and governments is to actually be able to communicate honestly about what precisely the problem is. And calling everything cyber war is I've written about this a lot, and I know people in this room have as well, is just simply not the right way to go about it. So certain clarity of definition is certainly required.
Yes, please, in the middle there.
Hi, Arturi Lehtiö from F-Secure in Finland. Sorry to kind of go back to the earlier points on attribution, but I was wondering, to build off of that, in the context of power in and through cyberspace and the challenge of attribution, what's your opinion? Is it possible to project power? Is it possible to coerce, for instance, and still stay anonymous? Or does an actor have to kind of show themselves to be able to project power and actually be able to gain an effect with that?
Wow. Since I haven't written the paper, I'm going to sort of write a disclaimer right there. This is my immediate thought. Ragnhild's paper is trying to take a theory and feed a couple of cases into it, right? So I haven't thought about what's possible beyond that, sort of try to dream up stuff. But the thing is, in order to coerce, you actually need to have a signal about what you want to achieve, right? There has to be. So if you can produce that signal and remain anonymous, I'm not sure if you're then in the realm of attributable but deniable already. I would expect so. The thing about attribution, though, is what you need it for. Do you need it to know who's attacking you? Or do you need it to prove something in international law? At what level do you need your evidence base to work? And so I believe it would work attributable but deniable-ish. I think you have to be very skilled to set up the right, maybe some confabulation of relations where you make one actor play another with your coercive message and then manipulate that through cyberspace, I don't know. But you have to get pretty advanced, I suppose.
If you look at F-Secure, for instance, you guys covered the Shamoon case against Saudi Aramco. It wasn't attributable, well, not to 100%, but there was a strip of a JPEG image of a burning American flag.
Yeah.
So that burning American flag in terms of productive power signifies something, that these machines were wiped by an actor, perhaps opposing Western suprematism in the Middle East. So yeah, you don't have to be attributable to a location, but you can be attributable to a certain ideology or a certain point you're trying to make. So I think that's the case where, well, there is a message in there without being location.
Yeah, I think it speaks to what we've said several times, which is if you want to generate political effect, strategic effect, it's very difficult to do that anonymously. Yeah. If you want to conduct cyber criminality for financial gain, it's very easy to do that anonymously. So again, I think we have to sort of disaggregate precisely what it is we're talking about. But in the political realm, it's difficult to be anonymous and get what you want, which is what you said. Yeah.
Yes, please, at the end.
Thank you. JD Work, Cyber Conflict Documentation Project. Y'all are talking about moving beyond a means view of power. Does this give us tools for advancing the thus far failed discussions around either cyber arms control or norms around restrictions on capabilities development, capabilities employment in cyberspace or cyberspace operations?
Who'd like to start?
I think that those discussions are already beyond means because they're talking about norms and laws. And norms and laws do not have a material substrate, they have an ideational substrate, which means that we're basing them off cognitive processes, mutually understood recognition of certain processes, and so on and so forth. Laws and norms are what's required for cyber arms control rather than any form of, obviously, monitoring, verification, compliance, very important issues, but actually you're not going to get anywhere unless you have collective normative buy-in to the project that might be something that is cyber arms control or something of that ilk. So yes, in answer to your question, yes, of course it does. It gives us a purchase on understanding the power and the politics of that process. Because obviously that's going to be a contested process, as it already is, and has been, in fact. If you go back to Dorothy Denning's work at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, when she started talking about precisely this issue, she said, don't even bother trying it unless you're going to have normative buy-in, which is obviously already talking about the other forms of power rather than just compulsory power. And it's actually talking about other forms of how power operates through normative structures and mutual recognition of values and beliefs and so on. And of course, states within that process want to preserve freedom of movement. You see things like the Wassenaar Arrangement, contested debates around whether that's the right thing to do from particular state parties. And yeah, I mean, discourses around those are problematic and very much part of the whole power piece. And of course, also institutional power. CCDCOE is, as we heard this morning, is the home of the Tallinn Manual process, which talks about, in small part, for example, how cyber weaponry should be understood within this field. And that's based on legal and normative understandings of international law. Those are forms of productive power, but they're also, the TMP itself is part of an institution. And there's institutional power working through there as well, which is why the Russians can't stand the Tallinn Manual process. And were they doing the same, I'm sure they get a similar response from NATO. So these things are contested, and we can understand that through these through these lenses of norms, values, beliefs, which are all implicit in this idea of productive power and very, very influential in terms of institutional power as well. Yeah.
Any other comments?
No.
Any concluding remarks from speaker's side?
We've got a long way to go, huh?
Yeah. The thing is, though, if I were to say anything to sum up here, is that we have a lot of tools which we applied at a lot of other problems, especially related to power, but in many other places as well. And just trying to apply those to this problem as well will get us a lot further ahead. It's not necessary to reinvent the wheel here. And it's not necessarily that revolutionary either, the conclusions you get to.
Okay. In conclusions from my side, actually it's a complicated topic, and I think it's one of the most complicated topics if we speak of cyber or cyber power. And I'm very happy that we have different theoretical frameworks, partially overlapping, partially diverging, but we stayed at the theoretical level, and it's rather hard to stay at the theoretical level. It would be much more easy to speak about concrete cases, but I think that this exercise and continuous exercises in this field, in cyber field, at theoretical level, this is absolutely must if we think about the future, about the need to formulate or advance our policies. And with these words, I'd like to say thank you to all of my speakers today and hand over small gifts on behalf of the CCD-CAE. Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And thank you. And thank you all.